Illumination. That phrase has recently popped up again as a version of it via ray tracing has been introduced into Metro Exodus's Enhanced Edition. But Metro Exodus is probably not the first time you've heard the phrase Global Illumination, and you've probably heard about it long before real-time ray tracing was the hot topic in video game graphics. In today's video, I will answer the question of what Global Illumination is by explaining its basics. I will talk about what people really mean when they say that word, and I will detail why global illumination is so important to video game graphics. And then I will discuss in broad terms how games in the past have attempted to achieve global illumination before the advent of real-time ray tracing as we know it today. So please pull up a chair and listen while I take global illumination under the lens of tech focus. Let's start with the term itself to understand it as a concept. Global illumination can be understood just by looking at the word itself. We have global here on the left, as in world, as in everything around you, everywhere. And illumination on the right, which really just means light. Global illumination essentially describes light coming from everywhere. Basically, light from everything that emits it. To understand what is meant by light coming from everywhere, it is best to think of light occurring in steps. The first step is direct light. Direct light is the first light emitted from a surface like a light bulb, a flame, or the sun, which then traverses and hits some sort of surface. Like here, the sun emitting light which hits this red rock. When people refer to global illumination usually, they tend to take direct lighting as a given. And this direct lighting step is not actually what people are referring to when they say global illumination, even though, like I said, direct lighting is a part of global illumination as a concept. Rather, when people talk about global illumination, they usually mean the second step, which is indirect lighting. Indirect lighting is the light that hits a surface and reflects off in different directions perhaps, and light up other surfaces nearby. So in the case of this rock, it would be the light that is not absorbed into the rock, but the percentage of light that reflects off of its surface, picking up some of that red color along the way, and then hitting the ground or other areas nearby, giving that area a red tinge. Depending upon the intensity of the light and how reflective the materials are, the light can bounce around many times, going on until the light energy is completely absorbed. Indirect lighting can mean many bounces of light. As a concept, global illumination does mean direct lighting and all indirect lighting and all the bounces of light that occur. But commonly when people say global illumination, they actually just mean the second step of indirect illumination, the light scattering around a scene after it has already hit objects. So why is indirect lighting such a big deal? And why do people say global illumination when they mean indirect lighting? The reasons for this being the case are actually linked. Firstly, indirect lighting is essentially what makes images and objects look the way they look. Indirect lighting makes objects look real. Here is a scene from Quake 2 RTX with just direct lighting on from the sun or any of the artificial light sources. It looks fine enough, but there is a lot of visual information here that is missing that would trick our eyes into saying that this looks anything like a real image. Now let's add in all the indirect lighting with bounces of light and reflection. Now this scene is starting to look more like something that we could say is approaching reality. It looks a lot better. The second reason why global illumination is such a big deal is for the same reason that people mean indirect lighting when they say global illumination. Indirect lighting or global illumination is such a big deal because it is hard to emulate or simulate. So if indirect lighting is hard to emulate or simulate, how did I just simply turn it on with the flick of a switch here in Quake 2 RTX? What's the big deal? Why not just flick that switch for every game out there? For Quake 2 RTX, flicking a switch to add in indirect lighting is comparatively simple because Quake 2 RTX uses ray tracing. That is not to say Quake 2 RTX was easily coded or anything like that. Rather, that ray tracing makes it simple on a conceptual level, as ray tracing is about capturing light from the perspective of a camera. I can explain why ray tracing makes this simple conceptually through an example. Let's pretend we have a camera placed here in a 3D scene, and this camera has a certain resolution. To see that scene with ray tracing, a ray is shot out from one of the pixels in the camera into that 3D scene to hit a 3D object. This object from the pixel's perspective can be shaded by tracing more rays from this point onward. For example, from this point on, the ray could continue on in the direction of a light source to find out whether or not the pixel is going to be in shadow from that light source or affected by it, so as to draw shadows. Another ray could also be sent out and bounce at an angle based upon the object's material property, like whether it's a metal or not, to go on and hit another object and generate a reflection of that object in the pixel. If the programmer wanted, the ray could go on from there to get even more accurate color information for that pixel to represent more types of light phenomena. More rays though, and more bounces of light, means a lot more calculation time. Excluding that calculation time though, I think you can see how ray tracing is conceptually simple, as it is mapping the way light moves around the scene from the perspective of a camera. The fact that it is and was computationally expensive though cannot be understated. It took till 2019 to get a game with graphics from 1997 to simulate light in this way. Even now, this is very expensive to compute. Ray tracing was too expensive for such a long time to be viably done in real time with acceptable visuals and frame rates. Instead of ray tracing, game graphics were then actually drawn typically to screens with a technique called rasterisation, which is much faster to do. The problem with rasterization is that it does not really conceptualize lighting in what it's doing by default. Rasterization by default is not about light, it's just about drawing a 3D object onto a 2D screen. In ray tracing, a ray is shot out from a camera to hit a 3D object and then shades the corresponding pixel, typically with more rays. You can imagine rasterization going in the other direction. Rasterization is the process where a 3D object is transformed onto a 2D image based upon perspective. This is all it really does, and it does it really fast. It is just about getting unshaded, perspective-correct geometry into a 2D image. It is not by default simulating lighting at all, and it's not really concerned with that. So for rasterization to make it look like objects are lit or shaded, this requires extra passes of computation on top to emulate the look of lighting. So what does light look like in rasterization? Here I want you to imagine that there's a representation of a light placed into a 3D coordinate in a flatly shaded rasterized scene. From here, the surface of the objects in the scene, like a sphere, are shaded based upon the curvature or direction a surface is facing, called its normal, and the direction or vector to the light nearby. By default, this form of lighting can show the appearance of diffuse light affecting one of these objects. So like the part of the sphere that is slightly darker away from the light, but also slightly lighter closer to the light. And then another bit of maths can be done to draw a specular highlight from one of these lights to mimic the appearance of the reflection of light on that object surface. This is done by doing what we did earlier with the surface normal and the vector to the light, but also adding in the vector to the player camera or viewer perspective. If you noticed, this is only direct lighting, as in light coming from an emitter and hitting a single surface. Rasterization by default cannot show any indirect lighting. The sphere that I'm showing here that has a reflection and its shading affected by this light source nearby actually does not have any understanding of the light from the objects nearby. It just has the emulated surface look from the direct light from a specific light source, not reflections and light from everywhere, as what global illumination is really about. People say global illumination when they really mean indirect lighting because rasterization generally solves the first part of global illumination in a fine enough manner. Rasterization can emulate direct lighting, but it cannot do indirect lighting in a simple manner. But even then, games over the last 30 years have of course had indirect lighting in them. If games did not have indirect lighting in them, then every game would just look like Doom 3, where inside a shadowed region in Doom 3, light is pitch black. There's no shading there at all. Games obviously have color or some sort of shading in areas of shadow, so not every game looks like Doom 3. Here's the part of the video where I will go through a number of techniques which have been used to emulate indirect lighting from a high level. This list is not going to be exhaustive at all, so I will skip over some techniques as well as simplify aspects of the techniques I describe for reasons of conciseness. I'm going to be focusing on the broad strokes essentially and the largest adopted techniques. The first technique that really comes to my mind here is light mapping. Light mapping is running an entire game scene or level through an offline process to find out the shading and color bounce from lighting in a scene with ray tracing or other related methods that are then translated into information on a texture, which then are applied to a game scene at runtime when people play it. With light mapping, textures are applied to the game world surfaces that make those surfaces appear as if indirect lighting is touching them. This is done without the cost of having to calculate that lighting in real time. The lighting is the textures, essentially. One of the first, if not the first games to use light maps that captured indirect lighting was id Software's 1997 release of Quake 2, where even just on the first level, it's possible to see the appearance of light from the outside, from the sky, coming through these pillars here and lighting up this enclosed area. The lighting coming in is brightening up this area even though it is enclosed. This technique is still used to this very day in much more advanced and detailed forms with higher quality textures, where games like The Last of Us Part 2 use light mapping heavily to give it its distinct look. In The Last of Us Part 2, there are not many direct lights in a number of scenes, so light mapping is one of the primary visual tools that give many scenes in this game its particular look. So this technique gives games the ability to show off indirect lighting without having to do the calculations for that lighting in real time, which is a huge performance win. But this technique has its downsides, of course, and I think one of the best ways to show them off is to look at an older game that used light mapping. Coming back again to id Software with Rage, which came out in 2010. Light as a texture, like a light map, is key to how Rage looks, much like it is key to how The Last of Us Part 2 looks. But Rage makes the downsides of light mapping, I think, more obvious since Rage uses light maps in such a total fashion. Almost all this game's lighting is light maps. One of the downsides of light maps is that only objects that are static are affected in the uniform manner by the light map. So to make sure lighting looks consistent and plausible, environments or light positions cannot move. Otherwise the lighting would break as textures no longer align properly. In Rage's case, this means almost nothing in the environment moves at all, both lights and the geometry of the environment itself. Light mapping imposes game design and interactivity limitations so that lighting does not break. As a part of this, since light maps only uniformly interact with static objects, dynamic objects like character models or physics objects or animated objects have to be shaded or lit in some different manner. This is why a character model on the ground in Rage, like you see here, looks shaded rather differently than the rest of the static world. Or take a look at these dynamic objects here that you can pick up, which seem to stick out in an obvious manner. Dynamic objects almost look like animated cell objects on top of matte paintings in old cartoons in games that use light maps, where it can be easy to tell which objects might be movable based upon how they've been shaded. Another limitation from light maps too comes from the dynamic aspects of light not necessarily being represented in an easy fashion, such as reflections or specularity. Essentially that tight highlight that I showed off earlier on a very shiny sphere that video games emulate with direct lighting in a rather good fashion cannot be done for indirect lighting with light maps, as the appearance of specular lighting changes based upon the camera's orientation toward it. To understand this more easily, just think of a mirror. When you move around a mirror and look at it, you can see the objects being reflected in the mirror change. This highly reflective light or specular light or mirror-like light is view dependent. So light maps are generally static and as a result can only represent diffuse lighting in a consistent manner by default. Diffuse lighting is the very dull lighting that sticks to a surface that looks the same no matter which angle you look at it. So like the bouncing color off of a dull surface hit by sunlight. Lightmaps can show that very well, but they cannot do that same thing necessarily for bounced light off of something shiny like metal. So lightmaps usually need a separate way to represent this so-called specular indirect lighting. A last limitation from lightmaps comes from the fact that they're textures, and all textures have a finite resolution usually, and they have to fit into a certain amount of video memory that a game has access to. So the resolution of lightmaps is limited, where there can be visible hard edges and pixels or aliasing in the lightmap itself. For example, take a look at the shot here of Final Fantasy VII's Remake, where the lightmap's low resolution is clearly visible as big pixel edges in the game's lighting. Lightmaps can essentially require a lot of video memory. Many of these limitations of lightmaps have seen progress and research over the years with various solutions to help alleviate some of these issues. For example, Half-Life 2 extended its lightmaps in 2004 to affect the normal maps of static level geometry so that it could show off reflective or specular lighting in a more accurate manner, at the cost of utilizing more video memory. Or even Rage, which I was being so critical of earlier, used its famous megatexture technology to help increase the resolution of lightmaps by having the lightmap and the object texture be one and the same, no longer competing for memory and saving space to allow for surprisingly high resolution indirect lighting or indirect shadows for 2010. But still, the biggest issue with lightmaps was and is essentially that it means static environments with static lights. And from the development perspective, changing art of a level in the middle of development means more time, as you have to recalculate scenes with a new lightmap for each change. With these limitations in mind, and the need to light dynamic geometry in some other way, a number of other solutions have come into existence over the years. One of the first types of indirect lighting not from lightmaps that comes to my mind is a very simple one, and that's to use a fill color or ambient color. Here imagine a ball with a stark shadow coming from a direct light. A fill or ambient color would be an artist-designated or programmer-defined color that would apply essentially to the darker side of that sphere to give the appearance of indirect lighting from nearby objects. There are many good examples of this. For example, the original Crysis did not have any light maps due to it having a dynamic game world where the sun was moving. So indirect lighting had to be covered in a simple fashion with an ambient color that could be set and might even change depending upon the time of day. So shadows in Crysis would not be pitch black, but instead have an assigned color to them. This is really simple though, as you can imagine. Other games did more complex usage of ambient color, like Conquer Live and Reloaded for the original Xbox. Here there were essentially two colors an object could have applied to them. Sky-facing surfaces would get the color from the sky, while ground-facing surfaces would get color from the ground. So in this area here on Conquer, we can see how the sky-facing parts of the model have a different color applied to them than those facing the ground. Now this application of an ambient color is very rudimentary, and of course cannot represent any of the finer details of indirect lighting that lightmaps really can do. It is essentially just a flat color, or maybe two for the sky or the ground, that applies to all objects across the game scene. It can maybe slightly vary depending upon the terrain or the objects or the sky's color, but that's about it. Two colors really at most. In terms of fidelity, lightmaps are much more detailed, but lightmaps once again can only work for static objects. Ambient or fill color works on dynamic objects and static objects, as we can see here in Conquer, where Conquer is a model that can move around the scene. From a developer's perspective, this means you get indirect lighting on dynamic objects. If a game exclusively used ambient lighting in this manner, like Crysis did, it would mean saving development time generating lightmaps. It would mean having a fully dynamic game world and not having lightmaps compete for video memory. Ambient color has its advantages, but it's very simple. It has this obvious problem of just being flat and uniform color. Image-based lighting, on the other hand, looks to remedy this flatness and also add in some new features. Image-based lighting essentially works like this. Imagine 6 cameras are placed into a scene and they render images of that scene from the perspective of looking up, down, to the side, essentially the 6 sides of a cube. These 6-sided cube images of the game scene can be stitched together and transformed to adhere to the surface of a sphere. This so-called cube map can then be applied to surfaces that are matte or diffuse to give them an ambient color that has the appearance of indirect lighting. So a matte surface can show off the color of the sky or the color of a ground due to a cube map. And with a glossy or shiny surface, the cube map's 6 different faces offer the ability for such a surface to have the appearance of sharp reflections, which change based upon the angle of the camera pointing at it. If you squint your eyes and don't pay attention too much, this cube map on glossy surfaces can look a lot like off-screen reflections. This technique is rather old, and some of the demos I'm showing off here on screen are from the early 2000s when the hype around this technique was really picking up in a fierce manner. Games from this time actually did have aspects of their indirect lighting done via cube maps. Let's go back to a Source game from 2004. Counter-Strike Source used cube maps to manage the reflections on small bottles here, for example. But still, the usage of cube maps for indirect lighting was still rather limited. There are many reasons for this. For one, cube maps need to be really high resolution to look like convincing fakes of reflections, so they require a lot of video memory, meaning there could only be a few cube maps in a game scene early on. Secondly, a cube map is the snapshot of a world from a specific point and does not actually line up with the player camera, so it can lead to issues of improper perspective on highly reflective surfaces. Like here in this scene, you can see the cube map does not really line up with the camera perspective here. To help alleviate this issue partially, you would need to place a lot of cube maps all over a game level. This means even more video memory needs to be allocated to cube maps to be placed everywhere. Another issue is that even though a cube map can apply to dynamic objects like this bottle here in Counter-Strike Source that can be moved around the scene or even destroyed, the cube map itself is not necessarily dynamic. A cube map is a static capture of the game world, and if the game world changes, the cube map by default will not necessarily show off that change. So imagine a game like Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which has a changing time of day. A static cube map would make the reflections in such a game only work correctly at one time of day. To alleviate this, cube maps would need to regenerate in real time so that the reflections from cube maps reflect the time of day or environmental changes. Regenerating a cube map in real time is very expensive, so you can imagine why this would further limit cube map usage. And a last issue was more a visual one. Image-based lighting is wrapping an entire scene's lighting around an object. So that means the individual objects themselves are not contributing to their own lighting. This is actually a large flaw for believability of that lighting, as objects in real life reflect and obscure lights from themselves. For example, a metal teapot does not just reflect its environment around it, but it also reflects itself, so you can see parts of it, like its handle, in the reflection on the teapot's surface. And that reflection of that handle, when you think about it, is actually obscuring the reflection of the world behind it. Cube maps do not handle this self-reflection of objects, so objects that have cube maps applied to them can glow in an odd manner or stick out in a way. Like here in Cyberpunk 2077, where I've purposely turned off graphical features so that the cube maps are the primary technique, giving objects in this scene their reflective properties. Image-based lighting via cube maps has a number of open issues, but developers found clever solutions over time to help work around some of these issues in fascinating ways. Racing games, I think, are an amazing example of this. Image-based lighting is key to making racing games look the way they do, and racing games usually generate and regenerate a cube map in real time attached to the car model near the camera. This makes it so that the appearance of specular light and reflections around the car moves with it and adapts to changes in the environment. It is expensive to do, of course, and requires a number of optimizations. Cube maps in racing games often use a simplified or lower resolution version of the scene, or they run at a lower frame rate than the rest of the game. But even with that, real-time cube map regeneration is expensive. but it still makes sense in a racing game, as a racing game is really all about making that car right in front of the camera look the best it can. Another issue with Cubemaps that developers looked to try and solve was that one I mentioned earlier of the Cubemap reflection not lining up with the rest of the game scene, looking like its perspective incorrect. A partial workaround for that is something called parallax corrected Cubemaps, which I recall seeing for the first time in a game called Remember Me from 2011. With parallax corrected Cubemaps, an artist sets up a bounding volume in an area with the Cubemap, like a box, so that the reflection from the Cubemap stretches to better align with the scene geometry when the camera moves. So like here in Remember Me, the Cubemap reflection aligns rather well in this environment if you look. This only really works though for those areas that have a box-like shape to them usually, but it is a clever way to help make Cubemaps more effective. Another Cubemap issue that developers tried to alleviate was Cubemap's lack of self-reflections, that glowing look that I talked about earlier. Now there were a number of techniques invented to try and alleviate this issue, but I think the most ubiquitous of them all has to be screen space reflections like we see here in Crysis 2 from 2011. This is the first time I remember seeing SSR. Here the glow on this model is alleviated to a degree when screen space reflections are turned on, as the little crevices of the highly reflective model now reflect itself and not just the area around it. In spite of all these awesome workarounds developers have made to make Cubemaps look better, not every game can solely use Cubemaps for indirect lighting. Firstly, because of the memory cost, as Cubemaps are still high-resolution textures that need to be distributed across an entire game world. And also, regenerating Cubemaps in real time is still very expensive, which is why you don't see it too often, and really only in racing games usually. So one of the last techniques I want to touch on is directly related to image-based lighting via Cubemaps, but offers a solution to this memory problem and the regenerating problem that Cubemaps have, and that is what I'm going to call probe lighting. This probe lighting, as I'm going to just simply call it, covers the idea behind a number of techniques actually. But the simplified idea is to have a so-called probe in the game scene, much like a Cubemap, but the probe is smaller and it captures the game scene from cardinal directions, maybe 4. It can be really thought of as an ultra low resolution Cubemap with just a few bits of color information in comparison. The probe can be generated completely offline and linked with a Lightmap for a static lighting solution. Or it can even be generated in real time through a variety of techniques so that probes can show off dynamic lighting conditions. If you spread many of these probes around a game world, then a dynamic object like a character moving between these different probes' influences could show the changes in indirect lighting on that model as it moves between the different probes, and therefore the differences in indirect lighting in those different areas of a level. There have been different types of integrations of probe lighting in games. A game like Killzone 2, for example, had probes be placed by artists around the level in varying density based upon the artist's discretion. A game like Half-Life 2 had these type of probes automatically arranged in grids around the environment and not artist placed necessarily. In both of these examples, these probes were used to apply indirect lighting to dynamic objects like characters, while static objects in these games had their indirect lighting provided by Lightmaps. These two games show off a static usage of probe lighting, as I'll call it. Both are linear games though, where time of day in the game does not change, and lights tend to not move. Other games have used probes exclusively as the way they do their indirect lighting, and they use it to light a dynamic game world, like Far Cry 3, which I think really pioneered the usage of such probes for dynamic indirect lighting. In Far Cry 3, the way probes were generated and placed in such a grid-like manner meant that the time of day could change and that the probes would update to reflect that time of day change. So the indirect lighting colors on the probes could actually change based upon whether it was night or day. On PC in Far Cry 3, they even managed to include the influence of dynamic lights into probes, like those from fires or artificial lights at nighttime, which could then affect the probe's indirect lighting colors. These light probes have a number of advantages, and it all comes from them being very small. They're Small size means they're easier on video memory usually than a lot of higher resolution cube maps. Them being small in size also means that they can be batch updated and regenerated in a comparatively cheap way in comparison to cube maps. So games like Far Cry 3 could have probes update with the game lighting to have dynamic indirect lighting all the way back in 2012. Light probes being so small and cheap means you can also place a lot of them around, so you can technically get more fine-grained detail at times than you might get with a lot more disparately placed cube maps. So there's a lot of pluses here, but like anything, there are negatives and trade-offs. For one, probes being so small and only capturing basic color information and direction in indirect lighting means very shiny surfaces are not really doable with them. For example, in Far Cry 3, you really will never find a metallic surface, for example, with a very coherent reflection on it, since the probes cannot represent that type of lighting very easily. In comparison to other games at that time which use things like cube maps, they'll have a lot of metallic objects with very coherent reflections on them, as cube maps allow that. Another issue with probes is that they can create lighting discontinuity for those games that use probes for dynamic objects, but then something like Lightmaps for static objects, like you can see here in The Last of Us Part 2, where the dynamic object here, the character, lit by probes, I think looks rather differently lit than the rest of the static geometry of the environment around it. Another issue with probes is that the accuracy of their indirect lighting is dictated by the density of the light probe grid. Probe lighting tends to leak through objects, like here in Far Cry 3, where objects inside this enclosed area are getting their indirect lighting information from probes outside, so they glow even though they're in shadow. The last issue with probes comes back to visual deficiencies they have since they're of such low fidelity. Unlike light maps, probes cannot represent small details or small shadows at all, so the appearance of shadows have to be added in after the fact on top of the probe lighting, and that's usually done in screen space with screen space ambient occlusion like you can see here in Far Cry 3. Here in Far Cry 3, SSAO helps reinsert shadows into the indirect lighting from the probes. Altogether here, I've looked at a number of techniques that have been used in the time before real-time ray tracing came about, and I've depicted them as separate or competing, as if they were at odds with one another or that one superseded the other. These techniques, though, are not necessarily competing. Some might be appropriate for certain game designs and others may not. And all these techniques do not have to be used exclusively. In fact, many games mix and match and combine all these techniques. A game like The Last of Us Part 2, which I mentioned earlier, uses light maps, light probes, cube maps, and even more techniques that I did not mention at all to create the appearance of indirect lighting. A game like this, which uses all these techniques and more, shows that real-time rendering of indirect lighting is complex, and a whole lot of disparate techniques are doing different things, and they're coming together to form a final image. And here's where I think I'm coming full circle. I've just described a fraction of the ways indirect lighting is emulated without real-time ray tracing. And I hope I gave you an appreciation of the complexity of this topic and how game designers and artists and programmers have iterated on these techniques over the last decades. Perhaps you can also see through this complexity how real-time ray tracing as a holistic technique is so enticing to replace or enhance these older techniques. But that is enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to enable more tech focus in the future, then please support us on Patreon and help us out, and also get years worth of DF content in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Global Illumination or indirect lighting, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!
She's feeling dark. She's feeling